Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How Big Data Can Help You Personalize Learning. I'm Sterling Lloyd, Assistant Director of the Education Week Research Center. I will be the moderator for this session, and will be selecting questions to ask our presenters. Education Week is only hosting this webinar and providing the moderator. All other content was created by the sponsor, who also selected the guests. The opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the sponsor and do not reflect the opinion of or constitute endorsement by Editorial Projects in Education or any of its publications or employees. Content for this webinar is provided by Texthelp. Before I introduce today's topic and our presenters, let me highlight a few technical housekeeping details. Please check the audio settings on your computer, as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues, please see our detailed audio troubleshooting file available in the resource list under the Q&A window. There are some other icons to open additional feature panels in our webinar console. You can read about today's speakers in the speaker bio window and click the resource list to download a copy of today's slides. Submit a question for our speakers, type it in the Q&A box. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and the free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. With that, let's get started on the topic of the webinar. In this session, guests will discuss ways that data can help educators understand how their students are performing and personalize their learning. We'll talk about the ways that personalized learning might support the needs of students in the classroom and the opportunities to make instructional decisions focused on those needs. Our presenters today are Dave Edyburn and Martin McKay. Dave is Professor and Associate Dean for Research at the College of Community Innovation and Education, University of Central Florida, UCF. He's also a co-lead of the UCF Learning Sciences Faculty Cluster. His research and teaching interests focus on the use of technology to enhance teaching, learning, and performance. Martin founded Texthelp in 1996 to help people with communication difficulties. Since that time, he has built, led, and directed a team of engineers to deliver technology that is used to help people achieve their literacy goals. With that, I will turn things over to our speakers. And Dave.
Thank you, Sterling. Welcome, everyone. Martin and I are pleased to join you here today, and we're glad you took time out of your busy schedule to be with us. As Sterling mentioned, we're going to kind of highlight three things during the webinar. We're going to talk about helping students become proficient writers. We're going to introduce the concept, if you're not already familiar with personalized learning, and talk about its implications. And finally, we're going to explore a product known as RIQ that uses big data that can help teachers direct new interventions that help students in their writing. So let's get started. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, what's known as NAEP, is a periodic assessment of students in our country that's designed to provide snapshots of educational performance. The most recent data on student writing is displayed on the screen here in two graphs. Figure A shows student achievement in writing at both the 8th grade and 12th grade level on the 2011 NAEP writing exam. What's significant about this data is it's one of the first times that students have been allowed to use online writing environments for a large-scale or high-stakes assessment in writing. But what's most troubling is when you look at the data here, if you start on the left and see the darker bar called below basic and then the lighter gray bar with basic, that the majority of our students in both 8th grade and 12th grade are below what the country expects for proficiency in writing. And so in the case of 8th grade, we've got 74% of the students that are basic or below. And at 12th grade, that number goes to 73%. So the challenge of this information is really important to educators as we think about our writing practices in the classroom. And the question comes up is, if we continue doing what we've always done, why would we expect to receive students that have different kind of results? So the writing data is really a call to action to say we've really got to look at instructional practices and the kind of technology tools and things we're giving students. So one of the other outcomes of the NAEP assessment is shown on this slide. that reports some of the data. Because students were writing in an online environment, we were able to capture performance data that indicated what kind of tools they used to support their writing, how fast they wrote, the complexity of the writing. And what you see in the callouts is that one of the things we discovered in this research is that 29% of the 8th graders access the thesaurus at least once. Okay, and so again, as a teacher, that may give us pause to say, okay, do students not understand a thesaurus? Do they use that and see that as a reference? In the old days with paper and pencil, we'd consider using external resources like that cheating. But now in the digital environment, we can provide those resources and then also track who used it, when, did it impair their writing because they spent more time browsing the thesaurus than actually writing. But if you go over to the left side of the screen, you'll notice that 71% of the 8th grade students used the text-to-speech tool at least once. And so now we have an example of something that used to be thought of something as assistive technology, something that we would give students that struggle to read or comprehend the text, now is deployed for all students to access. And basically you have a majority of the students using text-to-speech support. So that provides developers like Martin some very important information about the time and effort the developers need to devote to resources and tools within a product, because we've got data now that talks about how often they're used or valued. And then finally, that the research discovered that 80% of the 12th graders did not use cut, copy, or paste. And now that's also interesting because this is a controlled environment being an assessment, so students probably didn't have access to other resources to use those functions. But even copying and pasting within a document as we restructure an introduction or a conclusion and move text around, that in this environment that was not seen. And so the question becomes, does that help us as instructors to think about the kinds of strategies that we should be teaching students? So all of this is to share that now that we have digital writing environments and big data, that we can gain insights from the information that would allow us to, as we see on the next slide, personalize learning. What does it mean to customize either your pathway or the tools or the supports? Some of you may be familiar with the professional group called Inicola. They're well known in the area of online learning. They describe personalized learning using this definition of tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interest. And that includes facilitating the student voice and choice and not only what they learn, but how and when and where they learn, in order to provide flexibility and supports for the outcome we're looking for, which is to enhance the mastery at the highest level, highest standards possible. And so part of what we're going to see today is the use of technology to personalize learning. If we look back at the NAEP data and look at it seriously in the sense that our one-size-fits-all instruction in the classroom may not be helping a majority of the students. What is it that we need to deploy in a personalized sense of the intervention in terms of the tools, in terms of the strategies, in terms of the supports? When do we turn things on? When do we turn things off? Do we allow students to access all the tools all the time? Do we deploy a smart agent that gives you some advice to say, okay, you're struggling with this word. Would you like to find synonyms in the thesaurus? So in terms of the technology field, the futurists are telling us that we're going to be headed in a direction of personalized learning. And then my final slide before passing it back to Martin is to, many of the people on the webinar today are probably familiar with, if not the term personalized learning, one of the synonyms or points of confusion, which is called differentiated instruction or differentiation and or individualization. And there's a link on the screen that allows you to download a document that does a very nice side-by-side comparison of to compare and contrast these different terms. So some people argue this is nothing new. We've been talking about individualization for a long time, or our district already does differentiation. And so this is very useful to help both teachers and administrators understand what are we really talking about. And ultimately it goes back to the last screen we're talking about, is how do we design tools and supports and pathways to get students what they need when they need it to get to these higher levels of achievement that we're expecting. Okay, so here's my final slide before I pass it off to Martin. Here's a report that was just released last week. So again, if you're in a leadership role, you might take time to download this. This is known as the Horizon Report. This particular version focuses on trends and issues in technology, particularly relevant to higher ed. But one of the top trends that they call out here is that they use the term adaptive learning technologies to describe this field that Martin and I are talking about in terms of personalized learning. And they indicate that this is going to be transformative to all of us in both the short and long-term future, because these technologies and tools focus on this iron triangle of challenges that we all face, which is increased cost and the need to try to decrease cost, the need to increase access, and the need to increase the quality of our educational services. So these technologies and tools hold lots of promise, and yet there's far more work to be done to figure out how we capture that promise. So I'm going to turn the webinar back over to Martin, who's going to give us a preview of what all this theory looks like in practice as we create writing environments for students that are adaptive and functional. Martin?
Thank you, Dave. Dave, I really appreciate you participating in this webinar with us. For all of you who have joined to listen today, I've been working with Dave for many years now. My role here at Texthelp is a technology role. I'm not an educator. I've become exposed to a lot of educators and students over the last 20 years, and I've learned a good deal about educational theory, but my strength definitely lies with technology and kind of imagineering how we can bring technology to really make a material difference. And over the last few years, we've been really fortunate to be able to reach out and help a very large number of students. In fact, I think we've probably got about 14 million students who use our technology on an ongoing basis. And so really it's about how we can help that number of students at scale, how data can really be brought to bear. And one of the things that I like to use as an illustration is the Fitbit and the notion of a Fitbit for learning. So the Fitbit has really kind of popularized this notion of using statistical data. It's normalized the use of statistical data in fitness, and how kind of gamifying your fitness can have a really positive impact on fitness. So my mother is 75, I think, or 74. She'd be really cross if she heard me being unsure, but she knows how many steps per day she does. She knows what her resting heart rate is. She knows how often it goes, 30% above resting. My wife knows this information about herself. So do I. I know I have my 10,000 steps done before breakfast. We all are very aware of this now, but the Fitbit's not an intrusion in our lives. It's actually useful, It tells the time. We probably get some notifications of things that occur, but in the background, it's collecting data, and that data is useful. And when that data is summarized and delivered to us in a timely way, we can respond to that data and improve our fitness. And so that's what we're trying to do at Texthelp, but what we're trying to do that with is learning, and the notion of learning metrics and learning analytics. So for a long time, software has had usage analytics. Websites have analytics, and you can see how many people visit your website and what pages are the most popular. And in all educational software, there are analytics. So for many years, we've known how many people use our software, how many people press the play button, how many people use the dictionary. In fact, like Dave mentioned earlier, 71% of people using text-to-speech. I'm unsurprised by that. That's just pretty normal information for me these days. I know that kids who use word prediction write longer words and more mature words, make less spelling errors. All of this data is useful. And we use learning metrics already. In fact, probably one of the most well-known sets of kind of learning metrics that people use as a yardstick in education are the Hasbrook and Tyndall oral reading fluency norms. And when we measure a kid's oral reading fluency, there are a few things that we use, but the core measure is this words correct per minute measure. So if you're assessing a kid's reading, and say they're in the 5th grade, and it is the winter term, then 133 words correct per minute is at the 50th percentile. And you can perform a reading assessment, an oral reading fluency assessment with a kid. They can read for a minute, and you can assess that reading. If you're doing it manually, using a stopwatch and a pencil and paper, the way that people used to do all this stuff, you can get to a words correct per minute score and look it up in the norms chart and see how the kid is performing according to the norms. Now, it's a little bit blunt because what is causing that kid to be slow? They could be making a lot of hesitations, or they could be making a lot of mispronunciations, and that could be negatively impacting their score. So the useful data is the insights into what makes that number. So this kid that's on screen now got 45 words correct per minute. But if you look at the detail of it, it's mispronunciation is kind of one of the items. If you saw a pattern where there's lots of mispronunciation or lots of hesitation, there's probably a foundational fluency issue there, and that information can be useful for a teacher. The teacher can roll back and say, okay, I want to do some phonics work with this kid. So it's a combination of seeing where that kid sits with the norms and then getting into the detail to see what the teacher can do to make a difference. But this is a really kind of manual process, and one of our products is called Fluency Tutor, and it takes a lot of the busy work out of this, but it's still, assessing kids' oral reading fluency is time consuming, and we want to get to this place, the Fitbit for learning. Imagine a Fitbit-like intelligent agent that is just keeping a track of things and collecting data kind of unobtrusively. So that's what we're trying to get to. But we want to talk a little bit about writing today. Because reading has been, reading has been done. Norms exist for reading, but there aren't really good detailed norms for writing. And I've been working with Dave now for probably a couple of years on noodling around this problem and trying to do this at scale and trying to do it in an inobtrusive way. And until recently, assessing a kid's writing was a fairly manual process. It would take quite a bit of time. And there are quite a few things about kids writing that you need to look at. How much are they writing? Are they getting stuff done on time? What about the mechanics of the writing? What about spelling and punctuation and grammar? What about the maturity of their writing and the types of sentence construction that they're using? And then obviously, are they answering the question? Are they using appropriate literary techniques? It's a sophisticated process, assessing kids writing. And until recently, it has been there's been a lot of manual effort associated with doing that. And so one of the things that you can do to assess the mechanics of a student's writing is to use correct word sequences. And a correct word sequence, I'm going to summarize this because it can get a little bit detailed. But if you give a student 1 point each time they get a sequence of 2 words together without making a spelling, punctuation, or grammar error, then every time they get 2 words together, they make a sequence of 2 words, they get 1 correct word sequence point. And I've got a little illustration to show you what that's like on the next slide. So you can see here, this is a photograph of an actual student's writing, and the teacher has put a little caret, a little up arrow, every time the kid gets a correct word sequence point. So if we look across this, you can see they get a point for the capitalization of hide. They get a point because hide and are both correct. They get a point because and seek is both correct. And if you read across here, you can see they lost a point because there was no punctuation between the word game and the start of the next sentence. You can see that if we look down at the word on the second row from the bottom, the word pretend, which was misspelled, the student lost 2 points because that one spelling error broke 2 word sequences. It broke the word sequence can pretend and the word sequence pretend to. So this is, people make up, scoring mechanisms, and then they have to go off and see, well, do these scoring mechanisms correlate with, existing writing assessment methods, and do they correlate with grade level and so on. So this correct and incorrect word sequences measure it's a really interesting measure, and it works. There was a research study done by Pearson, and they've shown that this correct and incorrect word sequences measure is a valid and reliable measure of the mechanics of kids' writing. In fact, I'm going to hand over. I would like to Dave to chime in at this point. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about, because you've got more, bluntly, you've got more credibility on this point than I do, around the validity of this measure and how the things that we've talked about to try to improve on these measures.
Yes. Well, as Martin was mentioning about learning metrics, the issue is that, okay, we've got to figure out how to quantify this to begin to make meaningful interpretations about differences in students' writing. And so correct word sequences is a very common metric in the literature of automated essay grading, which is part of what we're talking about here today to try and use some technology. The incorrect word sequence, again, is another metric. And so now the question becomes are those mutually exclusive or are they codependent? And so there could be some discussion and disagreement about the appropriate use of those. But in our work, we've discovered that the correct word sequences is a very powerful correlate. And that, so at the time, even though we can collect and compute both, currently we're deploying correct word sequences as a metric as we try to figure out if there are new metrics that are more sensitive to measuring student growth. And I think we can kind of think about the development of this field in some phases. And as Martin was showing us on the last screen, initially it was very manual. It was computerized in the 80s and 90s, and so there's a number of products out there that are based on that research. But those research studies are always done with controlled samples. And so as we're going to go into the next section, what Martin's going to show us is we're using a system that it goes on top of Google Classroom, and the data we have now is over 47,000 student papers that gives us what's called big data. And so as we begin to mine that big data, what are the metrics we should be looking for, and do they produce anything meaningful? And are there new discoveries to be made that we didn't know before? And so I think I'll stop there because Martin's got more to share with us. So back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. So as Dave was saying, this is a strong correlate. It does correlate really well with by grade level, and also if we divide the students up into quartiles or deciles, we can see within the good separation within the grades. But there are a few things about this. This measure is a little bit blunt. It doesn't take into consideration the speed that someone writes with, and it doesn't take into consideration the maturity of their vocabulary. And those are two things that can be readily assessed now, particularly with online writing environments. I think in the 5 years ago, when a lot of writing assessment was done on paper, and teachers would take a bunch of papers home or sit at the front of the class and score papers, they don't really know how long a kid spends, particularly if it's homework. They don't really know how long a kid has spent writing. If it's a class test, well then possibly they'll have an indication of how long the kid had an opportunity to write for, but they can't really tell how long they were actively writing for. But with software we can tell how often they write. But the thing about this measure is it doesn't matter how good it is, it doesn't matter how predictive it is. If it's a pain to use, if it's a hassle for teachers, it's just not going to happen. And teachers are really busy people trying to do lots of important and good stuff. And if they have to sit down and put a little blue mark between every word that a kid writes and then do some arithmetic on the left-hand side of the page and tot up the correct word sequences, it's just not going to get done. And it doesn't matter how predictive the measure is. If it's not going to get done, it's just not going to get done. It's like, the best pair of binoculars is usually a little small pair that you carry around in your pocket, because the big giant ones, while you may be able to see further, they're not convenient, and so they get left behind. So what we've been trying to do at Texthelp is getting back to this notion of a Fitbit for learning. So observing kids as they write and looking at how quickly they write, how often they make spelling, punctuation, and grammar errors, how long their sentences are, and so on, but doing that completely automatically and doing that in the background so that teachers can then just see a report of how children write and how their children are comparing to the national norms. So RIQ is our kind of first answer to that problem. And so I would invite anyone who's interested to just kind of Google it, look for RIQ, or you can visit the link that's on the screen there. There are going to be a bunch of resources available after this. But RIQ allows, basically, if a teacher opens up a piece of writing that a student has completed, we will already have assessed it, and we'll have identified the spelling and punctuation and grammar errors, and we'll calculate the correct word sequences score, look at the word count and the sentence count. We'll do all of that automatically. Been out there for about a year, and we've had a few thousand teachers using it, and any time that they disagreed with what we thought was the spelling, punctuation, or grammar error, that's been really helping us improve our engines, our AI in the background. And the first year of this product, the first year of its life cycle was really about collecting norms and collecting data. So behind the scenes, every time a kid completes a document, we can count the words, we can count the unique words, and this tells us about their vocabulary diversity. It's fairly common for kids to use a small vocabulary and use it repetitively if they're in a lower quartile. We'll also look at the number of sentences, the number of sentences that contain a subject, verb, and object, the word length, the syllable count, the text maturity, which is a really interesting measure. Every word in English has got an age of acquisition. So the word dog, kids who are really young, age 2, before they can write, they know and understand what the word dog means. When they're really young, they learn that the dog says woof. Around age 12, they learn the word photosynthesis generally. And usually, they're going to be 18 or maybe 19 before they learn the word photochromatography. And they may never learn that word. And so we can look at a piece of text and we can assess the maturity of that text. And we can even assess the subject matter. We can tell if something is, geography or history or science nowadays. Then we look at the mechanics of the writing and look at their spelling and punctuation and grammar error counts. And then we look at their time on task. And we also present a rubric for the teacher to do the real job of assessing a kid's writing. Are they, if it's a piece of narrative writing, are they developing characters? Are they using temporal vocabulary and so on? We were collecting all this data because, where I work, more data is better data. But we were seeking correlations in correct word sequences per minute, and we were seeking correlations in text maturity. I mean, it sounds pretty sensible that text should increase with maturity through the grade levels. And it also makes sense that you would expect that the text maturity, you would expect to flatten off a little, because I'm not reading age 48, even though I'm 48. My reading stopped improving a good few years ago. And so I'm not going to put the numbers on the screen here, but this graph shows the types of correlation that we found. So each of those little groups of bars is a grade level. So, along the middle there, you can see the 8th grade. The blue bar is the bottom 10%, and the orange bar is the top 9%. And then the bars in between are the people at the 25th and the 50th and the 75th percentile. And what this means now is that for this measure of writing that we have, which is a combination of looking at their mechanics, their spelling, punctuation, and grammar errors, their production, how much writing they actually do, and their speed, so their correct words per minute. If you were to look back and kind of look at this through the lens of the Hasbrook and Tyndall norms and look at correct words per minute of reading, well, this is correct words per minute of writing. But there's also another variable in here because we're looking at the maturity of the writing. And so if we get a writing score, we can now reliably place someone in one of these buckets and really help a teacher see how that student is performing compared to their class, but we think really interestingly compared to the national norms. And one thing that I would draw your attention to, and this is really no surprise for any educator, but that gradient, the gradient of that line, the gradient of the orange line is the rate of learning increase of that top 10% of kids, and the gradient of the blue line is the rate of learning increase of the bottom 10%. And it is kids who get or who are in that bottom 10%, they are at such a disadvantage. So what we want to try to do is help these kids to improve their game. In the way that the Fitbit tells you to, if you sit still for a long time, your iPhone or your iWatch may tell you to move, or if it's getting to 3/4 of the way through the day and your Fitbit doesn't think you've done enough steps or you're going to reach your 10,000 steps, it may remind you. And what we want to do with reading instruction and writing instruction is to try to, when the kids are doing this, when they're reading and writing on their own, we want to be capturing this data and gamifying it. So if a kid is writing and they write, 6 words in a row without a spelling, punctuation, or grammar error, they get some kind of reward. They can see a dashboard that shows them their writing history, their writing health, and hints and tips that they can follow to improve and boost their writing. So what we're trying to get to with all of this stuff is, it's a little bit down the line, but we want to be able to provide teachers with visibility of some of this stuff without teachers having to do anything. So if a kid has got Raiku installed, our vision is that if that's been deployed at your district, a teacher will be able to see all about their students' writing, how often they write, how many minutes per day they spend writing, how productive they are, so how many words per minute, or how many words per hour, or how many words per day they write, how accurate their writing is, getting back to the mechanics of their writing, and looking at their spelling and punctuation and grammar, the maturity of their writing. And we believe we can do all of this without teacher intervention. For the last year, we've been working with this Raiku data set. And when we assess a document, we present the teacher with that and then invite them to correct it or confirm our score. And our scores correlate with the teacher-corrected scores at 99.5%. Teachers don't correlate with each other much above, anywhere near that. So, this is valid and valuable information on its own without teacher-validated data. So every time a teacher uses Raiku and scores kids' writing, that creates a teacher-validated data point. But every time a kid writes anything at all, the data is going in there, and a teacher should be able to just look at a dashboard and see how a kid has been writing, what subject areas they write about, how often they write, and the quality and maturity and the benchmarks of their writing. We think it can really save a bunch of teacher time and give teachers an insight into that writing behavior and how that writing behavior compares with these large-scale national norms. And then also we think we can show kids this information, but not show them how they compare with the national norms. Let them compete with themselves. Let them see, how much they wrote last week and if they want to write some more this week. I'm sure Fitbit doesn't. It knows that I would disengage with my Fitbit and took it off if it compared me to, an Olympic gold medalist. It compares me with me, and it encourages me to, to become fitter. And really what we want to do is do the same thing with reading. And then also, we want to do some of the same stuff with writing. So we want to look at how often kids read. Very often these days they're reading online, and certainly with school materials from middle school onwards, a lot of the reading is done online. And we think that we can probably keep a track of how often they're reading online, what reading age content, what subject areas. Certainly we can tell when kids are using our assistive technology, how often they read, what subject areas, what tools they use to assist their reading, and what the maturity of those reading materials are. And part of our vision is to provide a really detailed learning analytics dashboard for teachers so that they can see what's going on in their room or in their classroom, and to help them get visibility and see how that reading behavior correlates or compares to national norms. Lots of really interesting things that are also available because of this. We're going to be able to see if reading engagement is improved by page layout issues. Is font size, does font size have an impact on reader engagement? We know there are studies that have been done that show that larger fonts improve legibility and they improve comprehension. 20 years ago, there was an economic argument that said, well, smaller fonts save paper and school budgets are under pressure. So, let's have 10-point font size in books. Not a great accessible thing, but nowadays with software, you can have, with ebooks, you can have the font as big as you want. We're going to be able to see, well, do kids with larger fonts, do they remain engaged? Do they even change the font themselves? All sorts of things about reading behaviors and engagement that we believe are going to be helpful for educational publishers to help them, create more engaging content in future. And also, like Dave says, these intelligent agents, if we can see that a kid is struggling, if they try to type a word 3 times and they're still not getting it right, we could offer them some predictive writing assistance so that if they type the first 2 or 3 letters or get the phonics almost right, that we can help in an instance where that's allowed in school, we can intervene and offer that to the student and to see if they want some assistance. So those are some of the things that we're working on. Dave, I heard you're about to intervene there.
I didn't think I made that audible noise, but yes, I would add 2 things, Martin. As one, you mentioned the teacher quality assessment. I don't think you mentioned that the RIQ has a set of rubrics. So mostly we've been talking about the assessment of mechanical skills in writing, and we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the quality of the writing because, again, kids could paste in a lot of just nonsense, and so we've got to have a way of doing that. So in this first edition, there's the teachers would select the genre, and then there's a pre-populated rubric that they would then use that to score the writing. And so that's been collected on the 40,000 plus writing samples as a first generation of developing the machine intelligence and machine learning algorithms for the artificial intelligence of the system. So now that we not only can divide students into different buckets by their percentile, is we have the quality indicators that tell us how many words they were generating, what's the quality of that writing, the text maturity of their writing. And so now, as the predictive agents begin to work, is that we can say, are you like the student at the 90th percentile, or is your writing more characteristic of student at the 10th percentile? And that will allow us to get better predictions and also give us a lot of information on how to design interventions. And then the second thing that Martin brought up is he was mentioning both reading and writing because we have Texthelp has Fluency Tutor and RIQ. And the reason this is a family of products is that we know that one of the biggest predictors of student improvement in writing is the amount of reading they do. And so again, if they're not exposed to different literary styles and vocabulary, that their fount of knowledge is not being built up. And so kind of the teachers already know this in terms of the interdisciplinary nature of what we do in terms of literacy development and encouraging kids to read. But now that we have data on both sides of your performance about that data can pass back and forth between products to, as we know more about your writing and your reading, your independent reading level, we could make suggestions about things you might read, but also then look to see is some of the words you're using in your writing, is any of that traceable back to what you read? And we know that for people to learn a word, you really have to have 7 to 11 exposures of that word. And so understanding more about your reading diet will help us more as we learn more about your writing skills. So those 2 things to add to Martin.
Yeah, I should expand on that, on Dave's point on the rubric side of things, because all that we're trying to do, we're certainly not trying to replace a teacher here. I want to make that very clear. All that we're trying to do is take some of that busy work out. Dave's absolutely right. We've got rubrics. So when a teacher is assessing some writing, we've got the 3 writing types that are kind of laid out in the Common Core State Standards. We've got narrative writing rubrics, informative and explanatory writing rubrics, and then opinion and narrative argument rubrics. And if we look at the narrative, we're scoring people, or the teacher is scoring people in this instance on focus and exposition. So, for example, at grade level, we're assessing engagement and character development. When we look at organization and plot at grade level, we're looking at the use of temporal vocabulary and having a conclusion in the passage. For narrative techniques, we're looking at dialogue and some narrative features of the dialogue. And then in language itself, we're looking at sentence structure, writing conventions, and vocabulary, and so on. One of the pieces of statistical work that we're doing is seeing if there is a correlation between these rubric scores and some of the other features of the students' writing. And so this is a kind of longer-term project, and we're using some machine learning techniques to see, for example, if we can detect temporal vocabulary in documents that have got a rubric score that's at grade level or higher for language sentence structure and so on. So lots of exciting stuff going on there. And Dave's right on this idea of having reading analytics, having learning analytics around reading and learning analytics around writing. That's incredibly important. Kids who are avid readers and read through choice, if they pick up a book and just read because they enjoy reading and they're hooked on a good story and they just want to turn the pages, they'll consume 400 times more text than a kid who reads only when they have to. And 400 times more text, if you read like that for 7 or 8 years at school, by the time you're going to interview for a job, you're a different person. You're, in that your learning has got a steeper gradient, your vocabulary is much richer, and that vocabulary that you get exposed to in reading, that's going to show up in their writing. It's going to show up in their resume, and it's going to show up in their work. And so that sort of thing is, we see that coming through in our data. The data is so rich. It's really it's exciting to be able to turn some of this stuff into a product over the next while. We're talking to a school district who is considering focusing not this year but next year on a major writing project, and RIQ is going to be able to help them completely benchmark their writing in detail for the district this year, so that they can then implement their writing improvement strategy and quantitatively measure that in a consistent manner across the district. So there are lots of opportunities to bring this data into practice in the classroom and really, not kind of just benchmark where we are now, but then also measure the improvement as we introduce these tools for students. So that is, and we're anticipating having about 45 minutes of us kind of going through the slides and about 15 minutes of questions. So I think I'm about 2 minutes ahead of schedule, Sterling. But maybe we could start the Q&A early.
Sure. So we'll now turn to the Q&A, giving our guests an opportunity to answer some questions from our audience. The first question from our audience is, while data can empower teachers and students, we find that school-based folks often do not know what to do once they have the data. How can we help them better analyze the data so they can take actionable steps?
I'll try first, and then Martin, you could jump in, but that's an excellent question. And the approach we're taking in this project, and I think many ed tech developers are doing, is the notion of dashboards. Is that how can I visualize the data? And some are using the traffic stoplight metaphor of red, yellow, green, so that if I look at a student record and everything's green, I don't really have to be too concerned that things are progressing the way they should be. But if I have a yellow area or a red, then I can either click and drill down or ask the system for some advice about what an intervention might be. So that's one of the ways that RIQ right now offers some initial feedback about student performance, and then trying to put it into a quartile to give teachers at least an approximation of where the student is compared to either local norms or state norms or national norms. And so that'll be helpful. So anyway, I think that's one piece. Is like, how do we make the data actionable? And so it usually starts with some sort of visualization through a dashboard. So, Martin, you want to add to that or extend it?
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of, the example that I used earlier would be it's being able to spot a pattern and then maybe indicate a possible recommended course of action. And we've avoided that because we think the teachers, if we present the information, they're expert enough to know what they should do. But if we show a histogram of error types in oral reading fluency, a teacher who can see that, the example I used earlier was if someone is making lots of hesitations or mispronunciations, that's indicative of someone who's, reading along, they come to a word and they first of all pause, that's where the hesitation comes from, and then they struggle verbalizing it because of probably some foundational phonics issue. And if a teacher sees that in sees that kind of graphic, that dashboard, that visualization of that student, they can probably say, well, I think I need to focus on foundational phonics for this student for a couple of lessons and then kind of reapproach oral reading fluency again. It's just, it's like, and, it's taking the broad number. I know that my daughter is 16, but when she was 11, they have this really important transitional assessment. And I remember a letter coming home from school, and it showed a graph with a dot on it, and this dot was my daughter. And that was not, useful or actionable. We don't want to be providing that sort of information to a teacher. If we show someone this number that says, well, your RIQ score is 132, that's not actionable information. If the teacher clicks on that, we're going to show them they are in the top quartile for spelling and punctuation and grammar, but in the bottom quartile for text maturity for that grade level. And then the teacher can say, okay, this kid is getting on really well with the mechanics of the writing. We need to introduce them to some new vocabulary. And probably a teacher would think, well, let's read some more, recommend some reading books that are maybe a grade level higher, that have got higher lexile level content. So, yeah, that's how I think about that.
Okay, this next question is somewhat related to the first one. The audience member asks, will you be showing what adjustments were made by teachers based on the writing data that led to improved student achievement?
So we, not this year, well, in the year that we've just completed, we were really completely focused on collecting the norms. So in this incoming year, this is the first time that we'll be able to see, kind of improvements, because year one is our benchmark year. So that's a really good question, and yeah, I would love to do that. It would be great to see, to have teachers tell us what interventions they've made and what's worked and what hasn't. I think the important thing for us is not telling a teacher what to do, but giving them the data and the framework to see if what they do has made a meaningful improvement. If it's not working, stop doing it, and if it is working, do more of it and tell more people about it. Is the approach that I would take there. But yeah, so as of right now, we have no means of showing, of kind of overlaying teacher interventions to show what makes an impact, because the first year was all data collection.
Okay, our next question is, do you see any potential applications for using Texthelp in mathematics class?
Well, yes. I almost think that's a question from Bernard. Bernard, you should come and work at Texthelp. We have. We've just last year we introduced a math product called Equatio, and really we're trying to bring that kind of same universal design for learning approach to mathematics and try to help kids make it easier for them to consume mathematical notation and also to write mathematical notation in a kind of UDL way. And from the learning analytics side of things, we're going to be looking at how often kids interact with math, from a consumption perspective, how often they read content that has math in it. And also, we can kind of assess the maturity of the math from the types of mathematical notation that's there. So if the page just has, multiply, divide, plus and minus, we know that it's kind of elementary arithmetic type stuff. If we see, matrices or, differentiation or integration, then we can tell that it's, certainly upper end of high school math and so on. So we have already got a math product there. We're just not we haven't really implemented the big data stuff with the math yet. We've got the analytics framework in place, and we just haven't kind of productized it yet. But that's in the pipeline for us.
Okay. A more general question. Our audience member says, I'm from a small public charter school. A lot of our parents are very concerned about screen time. They don't want their kids using technology very much. They need to have any computer time justified by data and used in an efficient way. I need help to find this balance. So can you provide any advice there?
I can try that. Dave.
Great.
Oh, you want to go first, Martin?
Yep, please, Dave.
Okay. I think the point is a good one, and so that notion about limiting screen time is may or may not be implemented in any school or any home. So that's not the real issue, because the data analytics can be operational no matter how much or how little. Obviously, they get smarter if there's a larger data set about a child. So I think that's the one piece. But the bigger trend that's happening is in the National Education Technology Report and the Horizon report that we mentioned earlier, that software is going to be built to use these analytics to what Martin referred to either earlier about observing the student when they're writing. Right now, that's lost information. The teachers don't have access to that because all we get is permanent product when the student is finished. So these tools that will allow us to infer more about metacognition will be more valued. And there is the concern that students could be left behind, kind of the haves and haves not with technology, that if everyone else is getting this information and that's making us more capable, will students who are not involved or don't have access, will that increase this kind of digital divide in performance? And so that's kind of an open question for the future. But I think all of us educators, as we try to plan for the future, we try to discern what is the changes that are meaningful and which are maybe just kind of fads that are going to go away. But it appears right now that everything we're seeing is that we need more instruction about, we need more data analytics about student performance, about the nature of their engagement, their performance over time. And since we started with the NAEP report, is our traditional instructional methods aren't powerful enough to get that, to extract that information about each student to get them to the level of performance when 74% of the students in 8th grade can't write at the level we're expecting. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a realistic point, but I think we probably have to try and educate everybody and to have more stakeholder conversation about, what we think are pros and cons and concerns about this. But, yeah. Martin, you want to join in?
Wow. I've got a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I, too, am concerned about screen time. I think that, I wouldn't have a concern about time spent writing on a computer, but, yeah, I share, I think, every adult who sees kids staring at LCD screens all day probably shares the same concern. It's about balance, and really we're just thinking about their kind of educational time. If they're signed into their school account, we're assuming learning time, and it's just that during that learning time we're trying to assess and keep a track of how they're behaving. There are a couple of things, Sterling, I'm just looking at the question list, and there are a couple of things that I really would like to address, and I know that we're coming up on the end of our time, or towards the end of our time. Can I just suggest a couple that I can answer really quickly?
Sure, feel free.
Jolanta has asked, are we aware of any norms like the Hasbrook and Tyndall norms that have been completed for languages such as Spanish? And I don't believe that there are, that I'm aware of. However, we would love to get involved if you are in a Spanish-speaking district, or if you're from Spain or South America. We would love to partner with you. Our Fluency Tutor product, which is an oral reading fluency product, has been localized into Spanish, and we would love to make the software available to you to help us collect and build these norms, because that obviously is going to be good for us in the longer term. So if that's something that you would love to, that you'd like to get involved with, we would love to help you. Jennifer asks, does the reading report provide a Lexile? And the answer to that is no. Lexile is a proprietary. We partner with Metametrics, who own the Lexile measure. It's a proprietary measure, and we are not able to give a Lexile measure. However, we can give you a reading age or reading maturity that correlates with the Lexile measure. Hopefully that would help. Then there was a question about platform agnostic. Kurt Bernhardt has a question about, so is Texthelp and Raiku platform agnostic? So we are generally platform agnostic. Our read and write product works on Windows and Mac and Chromebooks and iPads and Android devices. Raiku is probably about a year ahead on the Google side of things and on the Windows side of things. We've got Windows roadmap for Raiku. It's just not released yet. And it was easier for us to collect the metrics, to collect the benchmark year with one product rather than building 3. And so Raiku for Windows is in the pipeline. I can't disclose a date yet. I think those were the ones that I wanted to definitely make sure that I had addressed. Yeah, so back to you, Sterling. Sorry for jumping in.
No problem. We have now reached the end of our webinar, How Big Data Can Help You Personalize Learning. Thanks so much to our sponsor, Texthelp, and to our speakers, Dave Edyburn and Martin McKay. I would like to remind everyone that an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Thank you, and hope you will join us for future Education Week webinars.